Well, welcome, my friends, to a new edition of More Bad News, brought to you as always by Camel Cigarettes. Take the Camels Challenge, smoke Camels for 30 days and see for yourself what a difference Camels can make in your smoking pleasure. Since last week, Karen and I have gotten ourselves a new air monitor. I'll give you a little quick look at it. I know it's not going to be able to see this very well, but this is, it monitors for uh, volatile organic compounds, VOCs, uh, formaldehyde, uh, PM 2.5s, that is small particles that are 2.5 microns or smaller. That's 2.5. Your hair is about 70 microns in diameter. So 2.5, your hair is 70 microns. We're talking about 2.5 microns, very, very tiny particles. And PM10s are, again, 10 microns in size, considerably smaller than human hair. It also monitors temperature and humidity, and it also tells me what the CO2 content of the air is. So you start to cook in the kitchen, and the toxic levels rise. This machine starts to record, but it's the smell of dinner that is killing you with kindness. And that is my point about smoking Camels. You're drawing huge amounts of particulates into your lung, but it's like the smell of dinner. It may be bad for you, but it's what life is. Not to enjoy the pleasure of a fine cigarette after dinner. Back when everyone knew that more doctors smoked Camels, everyone also knew that tobacco is good for your digestion. This is particularly true of a good cigar. That is why the gentlemen always used to withdraw to the parlor for a smoke. Our new monitor brings me a new awareness of the CO2 levels in my home and globally. When I was a kid, I was breathing air that contained about 300 parts per million of CO2. In 2007, a group of environmentalists formed 350.org, which was an organization formed around the goal of keeping CO2 levels below 350 parts per million. Today, global average CO2 levels is measured from Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii stands at about 419 parts per million. But in my office right now, it's 764 parts per million. And it varies in the house from 6 to 800 and sometimes goes up even to 1,000 if you're cooking. CO2 levels over 1,000 are considered unhealthy. And the higher the CO2 levels, the greater the impact on cognition. Right now, the air outside contains dangerously high levels of fine particulates, making outdoor exercise inadvisable. An Israeli study recently showed a connection between our intestinal biome and autism. And it just makes sense that our cognition would be affected by CO2 levels, by our microorganisms in our bodies. Thinking takes a lot of energy, and it can be exhausting, and it requires nutrition, it requires metabolism, and above all, it requires oxygen. So it shouldn't be any wonder that the average of human intelligence is declining, that test scores are declining, that children are falling further behind in their reading and math. In my days, children went to school and they learned how to line up when the bell rang and sit at their desk all day. Today, children are taught how to dodge bullets. Well, my friends, the bad news seems to be proceeding at a dizzying pace. This past week, we have seen a heat dome over much of the Southwest with temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit for the past 2 weeks, massive flooding in the Northeast, which has put Vermont at risk of being the first state to disappear. We know that after Katrina, that population centers do not recover well from massive flooding. People are forced to flee, and the poorest simply cannot return and rebuild. New Orleans lost about half of its population after Katrina. It's slowly been building back up, but it's never come back to the original population. And I expect the same thing will happen to Vermont. And when hit repeatedly, these population depletions will go a long way to moving populations from one place to another and creating ever larger population of refugees. The monsoon flooding in India was even more devastating than the flooding in Vermont. So around the world, we have had Japan, China, Europe. We have reached a point of transition, I think, in the global climate. I commented last week on what a difference a year has made. A year ago, I was frantically warning my students to notice that it was dangerous to breathe the air, but that was because of the pandemic. I didn't imagine that a year later I would be shutting my windows and running 4 Corsi fans to keep the air within my home relatively safe. So 2 new books arrived this week, and I wanted to share them with you. The first one is the Nutmeg's Curse. It's a beautiful book. Um, and I've been introduced to Amitav Ghosh, wonderful, wonderful author. I first came across Ghosh in a YouTube discussion of the Geniza archive that with this guy, Mark Cohen, who is an expert in the Geniza, but also this book I used in my um, uh, I used to teach Mideast, and this is Under the Crescent and Cross, the Jews of the Middle Ages, and he's an expert on the Geniza archives. So Ghosh and Cohn were talking about the Geniza archives. Ghosh was the author of a book called In an Antique Land, which tells the story of a 12th century Jewish merchant who fled Egypt because of blood feud in the family. So he left Egypt and he moved to India, where he was a merchant between India and Egypt, and where he married an Indian woman and acquired an Indian slave, who eventually inherited his whole business. And the documents in the Geniza Cairo, so when he retired, he went back to Egypt. He became a member of the synagogue and took all of his papers and dumped them in the Geniza, where centuries later they were recovered and used to write this extraordinary story of an individual, of a slave and a Jewish merchant in the 12th century. The book is not just historical fiction, but it's also biography, anthropology. It's a critical analysis of modern capitalism and imperialism. He's an amazing, brilliant writer. And since he wrote this, he's gone on to become an internationally recognized author. You can find some very good YouTube conversations with Ghosh about the Nutmeg's Curse, as well as his previous bestseller, The Great Derangement. So he's been writing a lot of the material that I've been talking about, this end times kind of putting it all together and how we got here. The other book that came this week is this one here. This one came actually just this morning, and it's called, The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet by Jeff Goodell. And the back has all of my favorite people on it. Elizabeth Kolbert, the author of The Sixth Extinction, David Wallace Wells, the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, Naomi Klein, and Kim Stanley Robinson, who I haven't read, but he's a science fiction writer who does the same thing, end of time science fiction. And Amitav Ghosh, of course, he's also on the back here, and Michael Mann, the climate scientist. In a recent town hall sponsored by Bernie Sanders, Where Do We Go From Here is what it was called, and you can find it on YouTube. It was last week. Michael Mann warned that the next 2 years are going to be absolutely terrifying. We're not only entering the El Nino period of high ocean temperatures, but this is coming along with a new solar maximum, which together with record high levels of greenhouse gases is going to create a new phase of global instability. I believe that we are seeing a real phase transition here, the kind of thing that you see when water turns from liquid to gas. The planet is now boiling, and the climate chaos for the next 2 years is going to be unrelenting. Remember that none of this is going to get better. It's all going to get worse, so that when you see the water boiling, it's not going to stop boiling. We're now going to have to learn to survive as best we can while we watch large swaths of the planet become uninhabitable. We're also in the midst of the 3 weeks, and you see my beard is getting a little longer. I'm hoping to avoid cutting it until after Tisha B'Av, which is Wednesday after next, the 26th of July. This period is a period of mourning leading up to the destruction of the temple. Trapped by the Roman legions, the Jews inside the city turned on one another And in much the same way that Israelis today are warring against each other and threatening the destruction of their own homeland. And in Israel, many people are calling this the Churban Bayit, the destruction of the house. The Ninth of Ab proved that God was capable of abandoning his own house, his city, and his people, and allowing them to be brutally destroyed. That's the lesson. In reviewing the laws relating to our comportment during this period of mourning, I went over the Code of Jewish Law. That's this I have. This is a 5-volume. This is volume 4 of 5 volumes. Code of Jewish Law, and for the 3 weeks, the Code of Jewish Law says that a teacher should not hit a student, nor should a parent hit his children during these days. So this was written in 1864, this Code of Jewish Law. This is the Orthodox approach. During the 3 weeks, you shouldn't smack around your kids or your students. I guess there's enough sadness. We don't need to add to the suffering. This is a period where everybody's crying anyway. So that's my message for this week. Let's try not to add to the suffering of those nearest and most vulnerable to us. And that will be it for this week. I hope that you'll stay safe. Take the guidance of the Code of Jewish Law, which begs us not to add to the suffering of those around us. And I will see you next week. And that's enough for this week. We'll come back next week with more bad news.